A lot of people admire St. Francis because his message was one of peace, the gospel, and he is known for loving animals. But did you know he was also called as a missionary to Muslims, one of the first? In fact, it was a burden of his heart to share the gospel with them and die if necessary. 2 times he tried to make trips to the Middle East to share the gospel with the Sultan. And he was thwarted by various problems. The second time he was so sick, he could have died. And he had to abandon and go back to Italy. But on the 3rd try, he made it to Egypt, where the Sultan of Egypt, Palestine, and Syria was with his troops of many thousands of warriors. And St. Francis determined that he would get to the Sultan Malik al Kamil. And he thought he might not make it alive. People thought when they said goodbye to him, that could be his death. But he went in faith. He crossed the enemy lines of the 5th Crusade, and there was all kinds of violence around him. He was taken by the warriors of the Sultan, who beat him up and tortured him and abused him. Finally, the imams wanted to cut off his head, but Francis did get to talk to the Sultan. And he shared the gospel with the Sultan. He didn't want to talk about the church or structure, organizations, just the gospel. And the Sultan was so touched by the gospel that he told his imams, no, I'm not going to cut off Francis' head. In fact, friends, he begged St. Francis to stay with him and teach them about the Christian faith. But guess what? St. Francis went back to Italy because he needed to write up the rules of the regulations of the Order of St. Francis. But he still had a burden for Muslims. So when he went back to Italy, yes, he wrote up the rules, but he also wrote a manifesto for bringing the gospel to the Muslims. And what did the church do? It put into practice the rules of the Order of St. Francis, and it basically tabled his manifesto to Muslims. By tabled, I mean forgot about it. We can't even find out exactly what was in it, except we do know that it said, if you feel led to bring the gospel to Muslims, speak to your church superior about it. Wow. Did that make any difference? Actually, we've heard that after St. Francis' visit, Sultan Malik al Kamil was better to Christians. There's even a rumor that he made a deathbed conversion, but we don't know for sure. We just have to ask, what if Francis had stayed with the Sultan, with the Muslims there, and continued to teach until eventually they did kill him? But he didn't. Now, the same century, the 1200s, let's go about 70 years later to the other side of the world, to the Tartars and to Kublai Khan and to a fantastic empire, which at the time was the largest the world had ever known. You may have heard of Marco Polo. Well, Marco Polo's father and uncles made this arduous, long journey and met Kublai Khan. And Kublai Khan had experience with Christians, and he really liked it. And he told the father and uncle of Marco Polo, go back to the Pope, ask for 100 missionaries to come here and teach us everything about Christianity, because I believe it is the best of all religions. So Marco Polo's father and uncle went back to Italy. It took a while, but finally the new pope sent them missionaries. Guess how many? 2. And then they got to the border of Armenia, and guess what happened? They found out that there was a war going on in Armenia, and some of those people decided to leave. Was it the 2 priests who were called preaching friars? Or was it Marco Polo's father and brother? Which do you think had more courage? Was it the men of God, or was it the men of commerce? The men of commerce, the merchants, the explorers, Marco Polo's father and brother, went back to Kublai Khan to tell him what happened, and the 2 men of God panicked and went back to Italy. Oh my. Listen to what is recorded by Marco Polo in his book of travels. On many occasions, the Khan, Kublai Khan, had expressed his favor for Christianity. And he said when the missionaries came there, when they had presented their proofs, he could bring more converts to Christianity than existed anywhere else in the world because of the size of his kingdom. Marco Polo's family said from this discourse of what Kublai Khan had told them, it must be evident that if the Pope had sent over persons duly qualified to preach the gospel, the Grand Khan would have embraced Christianity, for which it is certainly known he had a strong predilection. I did not know this, friends. I just came across these travels of Marco Polo a week or 2 ago in a used bookstore and thought it would be interesting. And wow, I found out that Kublai Khan wanted to believe Christianity, and he was begging for missionaries, and the Christians were too scared. What if more had been sent? What if the ones that were sent were not too afraid to go on? So friends, now I want to say, what about you? I suspect you're answering me. I am not a saint. I'm no Saint Francis. I can't talk to the birds. Maybe you're saying, Marco Polo, I am no world-famous explorer. I can't do anything like this. I'm not even a preaching friar. But friends, guess who the 3rd person I'm going to tell you about is? It's a woman. Her name is Mary Fisher. She was not a priest or a preacher or a famous explorer. She didn't even want to be famous. She was a servant girl, but she had strong faith. In fact, she was persecuted and abused in England and then America. But she believed God was sending her to preach with the Sultan, this time in Turkey. This was in the 1600s. Mary did whatever she could to get over to Turkey. She ended up having to finish her journey on foot. And she went to where the Turkish Sultan Muhammad was, and she met with there 20,000 of his soldiers. And she said, I am an emissary of the Most High God with a message for the Sultan. She kept saying this over and over until finally she got to see the Sultan. And the Sultan listened to the gospel and he was amazed. And guess what he did? He asked her to stay longer and teach them. But guess what she did? She left. And then the English authority for that region, who was kind of like the ambassadors, they said, that's it, no more preaching the gospel to the Turks. We don't want trouble. Oh, my friends, can you see how exciting and tantalizing and yet tragic these stories are? 3 cases of Christians bold enough to share the gospel with world leaders of a different religion. 3 times they were asked to stay or to bring more teachers, and 3 times they failed. How would the world be different now if they had been true to their calling? And you probably know what I'm going to ask you now. How would the world be different now if you have a calling to share with Muslims or Hindus or Sikhs or any other faith, and you are not faithful to that? So whether you are high circumstance, like a saint or world famous explorer, or whether you are a poor servant girl, God can use you. And in the case of Mary Fisher, we also know that she made enough of an impact on Muhammad IV that he started to treat Christians better, just like the Sultan in Egypt started treating Christians better. And we do know also that Kublai Khan treated Christians fairly. So even if they're not saved, even if they didn't lead their nations because of inadequate training or whatever into Christianity, the mere fact that a Christian went and spoke to them did change the course of history. So don't belittle yourself and what you can do. Pray to God, say, "Here I am, send me," and see what He tells you to do and where you should go.